So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ginger, and I'm the Executive Director of the Connectionology Seminars of America. We are so happy to have you join us today. We've got a great webinar planned, wonderful speakers, and very excited about this. I wanted to let you know that we have a lot of other webinars coming up, and I'll be adding those to our website, which is Connectionology.com. So now we are ready to start because we have a lot to cover today. But first, we have our incredible moderator. His name is Todd Romano, and he's an attorney out of West Palm Beach in the Romano Law Group. He works with our beloved John Romano, that's his dad, who's actually getting ready to celebrate 50 years with Nancy Romano next week. So we're very excited about that. And then Todd also works with his brother, Eric Romano. He's currently the president of the Florida Justice Association. But Todd, he's basically been practicing in the areas of personal injury, wrongful death, interstate, intrastate trucking, and bus litigation, as well as commercial motor vehicle crashes, motor vehicle crash claims, pedestrian injury claims, vehicle and truck burn, as well as explosion and injury litigation. And he also covers motor vehicle product liability litigation. But another neat fact about Todd is that he was also a past president of the National Trial Lawyers Top 40 Under 40. So thank you again so much, Todd. We're gonna have a great webinar, and we're so happy that you're here with us today.
I'm happy to be here, Ginger. Thank you. We're gonna jump right into the program. This is part of a continuing series of traumatic brain injury webinars put together by Ginger, the executive director of the Connectionology seminar company. And I'd like to introduce our speakers, and then I'm going to turn it over to Kyle Kinberger to talk a little bit about HMR. But first we have Dr. Susan Swint out of Louisville, Kentucky. Dr. Swint is a physical medicine and rehabilitation specialist or physiatrist. Does a lot of work in the traumatic brain injury field and in rehabilitation, has served as an expert witness in multiple jurisdictions across the United States. And we're very happy to have you with us today, Dr. Swint. I understand that you and Hugo are going to be talking about a TBI case that you all did together within recent years. And so the program today is going to be a little bit more interactive between Hugo and Dr. Swint. And for anybody that has questions throughout, I'll do my best to monitor the Q&A, and we'll try to address your questions as they come up, or just bear with us if we need to wait a little bit until the end to address any questions. But alongside Dr. Swint, very happy to have with us Hugo Chanez out of New Orleans, Louisiana. Hugo is a fine young trial lawyer. His results speak for themselves. Near and dear to my heart, he happens to be involved in the National Trial Lawyers Top 40 Under 40. And Hugo's had success really in doing a lot of traumatic brain injury work in multiple different states and jurisdictions over the years. And when I looked at where he's had either trial verdict results or settlements doing TBI cases, basically all around this country, it's pretty impressive for somebody that's only been practicing for 12 to 15 years or so. But very happy to have Hugo with us, and Dr. Swint. We'll jump into the program here momentarily, but I wanted to introduce Kyle Kinberger. Kyle Kinberger and HMR have been instrumental in helping us do what we do for Connectionology through Ginger and bringing these programs to you all on a pretty frequent basis over the last few months. But as many of you know, if you haven't worked with HMR yet, you really should consider doing that. HMR is probably the largest plaintiff medical funding firm. I believe, Kyle, you've worked with clients and plaintiff attorneys, I believe, in pretty much all 50 states. If not all 50, I think you're pretty close. But we've worked with HMR. They're great people to work with. They're always going to be able to work with you and your clients and find solutions. If you have spinal cord injury cases, traumatic brain injury cases, orthopedic injury cases, reach out, talk to Kyle if you need assistance with medical funding and making sure that your clients can continue getting the care, the treatment, the rehabilitation services that they need. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Kyle, right now to make a few comments.
Good deal. Thank you, Todd. This again is such a great platform to be able to reach so many different attorneys around the country, and it's been, every week is so informative with different topics. But the installment series that's been going on traumatic brain injuries is really what kind of kicked this off. In talking with Hugo, who I've worked with for a few years now, when we were talking about traumatic brain injury cases, which is a big part of what we do and what we fund, each year, we were talking about it like an iceberg. You can only see the very tip of what's going on, and then 90% is under the surface. And that kind of cuts both ways. A lot of times we're seeing attorneys that come to us and they're saying, hey, look, I've got somebody, they were injured. They went to the ER, but they've got a normal CT, everything checked out, and somebody sent them home. And then the attorneys call in us saying, I got family members coming in saying this person's not the same anymore, or my son isn't the same person that I remember. And those stories kind of kept coming up with attorneys going, where do I take it from here? How do I take this to another level? How do I get these people the care that they need? And we were fortunate enough to, again, a few years ago, do a case with Hugo where that kind of scenario kind of presented, where it's a case being worked up. And fortunate for me, we do a lot of the funding, but Hugo was able to really take a deeper dive with me about, hey, the care and getting people what they need is one aspect of it. And it proves up what's really going on with somebody when you talk about cognitive deficits that people can't see on an X-ray or an image. And then how that equates to actually getting a case to a big verdict or a big settlement. Our discussion kind of led us to Dr. Swint, who he was saying, man, the documentation of this injury and how, everything was lined up with what this person was going to need for the rest of their life is something that he wasn't getting anywhere else in the country. And so when we kind of came together, we thought, man, wouldn't it be great to be able to educate people right now and let them know, hey, this is, how you identify these types of cases. This is what you're looking for. This is how you, work these cases up. And ultimately, this is the expectation for medical providers. So really happy that we're able to kind of bring this information to everybody who's listening. Like you said, Hugo Chanez is based out of New Orleans. He's one of the partners with Mitchell Sanchez. He's also a partner with the Cochran firm. He does cases all over the United States, which is really a testament to his practice. And so I'm gonna let it go and turn it over to Hugo and let the presentation go.
Thank you, Kyle.
Welcome.
So when we first talked about this, Kyle and I have spent a lot of time talking about traumatic brain injury, and I spent a lot of my time talking about traumatic brain injury, but it's the vogue now. Everybody wants to do traumatic brain injury. It's sexy. It's a great way to help clients who need help, and they're very big damages cases. Now, the majority of the traumatic brain injuries that I see and I get called upon by other lawyers and clients are the mild traumatic brain injuries. And those are a roller coaster ride because they're hard. They're going to give you stomach aches, and you need to focus on every single one of the details. And that's where this idea kind of came about. So I want to talk a little bit about the traumatic brain injury because people hear the word mild traumatic brain injury and think, well, mild isn't a big deal. Well, don't be misled. The term mild has nothing to do with the effects of it, but the long-term deficits. And I guess, Dr. Swint, could you please give us a rundown as to how we classify these brain injuries?
Sure. So there's kind of a wide variety of brain injury. You have mild, you have moderate, you have severe. The severe ones are easy to tell. It's somebody who comes in who's lost consciousness. Maybe they need some type of neurosurgical intervention, like a craniotomy. Those are pretty easy to pick out. A mild brain injury, like you said, though, is much more difficult. It's somebody who's had some sort of a force or trauma to their brain. A lot of times those are due to a motor vehicle accident, a fall, and you don't necessarily see it right away. So they may come into the ER. They always ask, have you had a loss of consciousness? And these patients may not have had a loss of consciousness. They may get a CT scan in the ER that shows that there's no injury because there's no bleeding to the brain. But that doesn't mean there wasn't any injury. And so they exit the ER, they're given a little sheet that says you may have a concussion, follow up with your primary doctor in a week. And they're kind of left to figure it out from there. There's a multitude of symptoms that can go with a mild traumatic brain injury. And people may not figure that out at first. It may be a family member that figures it out. The patient may not have the insight to figure it out, but a lot of memory difficulties, headaches, trouble with vision, trouble with hearing, trouble with concentration, a short temper. Some people say that, the patients just aren't who they used to be, a change of personality, trouble sleeping, PTSD. It's just a variety of symptoms. And not every patient has every single one of those. Some patients have really mild cases. Some people have moderate, but the brain injury is there, and a lot of times people don't see it at first.
So when it comes to this mild traumatic brain injury, Dr. Swint brings up a great point. Here's the thing about them. Most of them, they're going to be missed by EMS. There's the dreaded, did you lose consciousness question. Well, the worst person, the literature reports this, to ask if they lost consciousness is the person who lost consciousness. It's like asking somebody who can't remember things if they forget things. Well, you can't remember what you don't remember. And then they get to the ER, and in the ER they get the same question. Did you lose consciousness? Yes or no? Well, people think, I don't think I did, so no. And that stays in the record. Now, never does EMS ever ask the question, did you have alteration of consciousness? And Dr. Swint, do you have to lose consciousness to have a mild traumatic brain injury?
No. And there's that variance of consciousness. Are you dazed and confused? Do you have decreased arousal? And some patients, don't know if they did or not. I always tell my patients, sometimes the brain is protective and you don't remember those things. You have amnesia to the event because of all the trauma that's gone on. But a lot of times they don't lose consciousness, but they still have an injury.
And that's the thing with these injuries. So as lawyer advocates, we have an ethical obligation to represent our clients and to represent their interests and to investigate every single part of their case. And the mTBI is kind of this little hidden gem that you really need to look for to find out if they have one, if they need the care. Because a lot of mild traumatic brain injury cases are settled, tried without ever the word traumatic brain injury being mentioned to a jury or a adjuster. And what happens is 5-10 years down the road, you have a client with all these issues that are now related to the accident, and there's nothing you can do about it. So I think it's really our job to sit down with clients and sort of work these things out. You may have one, you may not have one. So for example, as we were talking about Dr. Swint, I sit down with all my clients and I have a checklist of questionnaire that I have to go down the list with them. And one of the first things I ask is, did you lose consciousness? You're going to get the answer, no. And then you got to dig a little deeper and say, okay, hold on. Do you remember every single part of the event? And as you ask those questions, you're going to find out they say, well, I know this happened and this happened. I don't know what happened in between. And then that's probably going to be alteration of consciousness. And you kind of sit down and you write it down for them. And then you go through the symptoms and say, okay, do you have headaches? Do you have vomiting? Does the noise bother you? Does the light bother you? Do you have memory problems? And you can't just rely on the patient himself. In fact, often enough, I say, don't just bring me the patient or the client, bring me the caretaker. And Dr. Swint, what is the importance of the caretaker versus the patient alone on a mild traumatic brain injury diagnosis?
Sure. That's something I find very important too, is I always want to see both the patient and then whoever is with them, most often who's living with them, who interacts with them the most. Because a lot of these patients don't have the insight. They've had a brain injury, so they're not able to necessarily determine what their deficits are. They can't remember what problems they have, or they can't formulate the thought as to what's bothering them most. But asking, a wife or a boyfriend or a girlfriend or child, what's changed? What do you notice they have trouble with? You're able to gain a lot of insight into what they've been experiencing.
There's a classic question that I like to ask, and it involves changes in personality. And specifically for that question, I ask the client first, do you have any change in personality? And it always says, no, I'm fine. Never been better. And then I ask them to step outside, and I bring the girlfriend, the boyfriend, the mom, the dad, and say, just between us girls, does he have any change in personality? Does she have any change in personality? And you would be surprised how many times they say, let me tell you what he does. When you go down this checklist of questions and you go into every single detail, you're going to find out that these symptoms are there, yet the client either is unaware he has them or attributed to something else. Perfect example. One of the telltale signs of a traumatic brain injury is vision disturbances. I have a client come in my office. Do you have vision disturbances? Yes, but it's not related to this. Okay. How do you know? I have cataracts. Okay. When we diagnosed with cataracts, a month after the accident, okay. Did you have vision disturbances before the accident 30 days earlier? No. Guess what? It's probably not the cataracts. But you are going to basically depose your client at the interview time to figure out if you have a brain injury. Now, I get calls from clients all the time, or lawyers say, listen, I got a problem with a client. I got a problem client. And whenever I hear problem client, I'm like, let's bring them in. Let's talk. You might have a mild traumatic brain injury. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the levels of care because we kind of touched on they get to the ER and they get, look, listen, did you get your head? Did you have a scan? You have blood in the brain? No, yes, go home. That's what we call the acute care. And I think Dr. Swint can give us a lot of insight into the difference between the acute care and the post-acute care.
Sure. So again, I made that example of somebody who's had a craniotomy, been in the ICU, they come to the step-down unit. Those patients are all in the acute care. They go on to an inpatient rehabilitation program straight off the bat. That's pretty cut and dry. It's a sticky situation with the mild traumatic brain injury who then are discharged to their primary care physician, who I'm sure is a great physician, but doesn't know a lot about concussion or brain injury. They're not a specialist in brain injuries. And so they may kind of say, let's go home, see how we're doing, follow back up in a month or whatever. A lot of times these patients aren't getting any type of diagnosis, any type of therapies, anything at all right off the bat, which is when we can really make a difference in these patients. We can make a difference years out, but if they're getting the therapy earlier, it's really beneficial. So there are different rehab options. There's outpatient therapies with physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, but there's inpatient programs too that are considered post-acute programs. So I am the medical director at one here in Kentucky, and we have an inpatient unit that isn't what you would think of as an inpatient unit for somebody who's just come out of the ICU. We have people who have mild traumatic brain injury. They're walking, talking, going around, but they're getting an intense rehab program. They're getting physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, a behavioral therapist, a psychologist, a psychiatrist overseeing this. We can refer them out to a neuro-ophthalmologist or an audiologist, just depending on what their needs are, and getting intense rehab in a program that they're going to have me overseeing, or a similar program having another physiatrist overseeing, where we can document the day in, day out of what we're seeing. Is it something where they start to make their breakfast and they forget what they're doing in the middle of it? Is it, we can just do life day-to-day examples and fix those through the therapist working with them with their interventions to see how we can improve their quality of life.
Hugo, I was thinking about something. You talk about the checklist that you go through at intake, and once you're checking enough of those boxes. What I always find the question I'm getting is, people going, okay, well, I think the next step is to get to a neurologist or a physiatrist, and there seems to be half the people that say I'm going straight to a neurologist, and half the people that say, hey, I need a PM&R. And so I'm curious, what's really the difference, and where do the roads split?
Sure. Well, I'm a little biased because I'm physical medicine and rehab. Neurologists are great too. We all deal with issues relating to the brain, but physical medicine and rehabilitation is an entire specialty that deals with people who've had some sort of traumatic injury that is preventing them from doing the things they were prior. So kind of our bread and butter: brain injury, spinal cord injury, strokes, amputees, things like that. And so physiatry is really a great option for those patients who need any dealings with brain injury, whether severe or mild. Some people don't know how to find a physiatrist. Some people have never heard of a physiatrist, but it's been around for a long time. And actually we do have a website, the aapmnr.org, where you can actually go to click a couple links and you can go straight to putting in your zip code and figuring out if there's any physiatrists in your area, which is a good tool. But they deal with brain injury all the time. We see them regularly. And we usually have a pretty good network of therapists and specialty resources that we can refer to try and get all the pieces of the puzzle. Because brain injury isn't just one clinical symptom. It's not one scan. We kind of talked about CT scans earlier. It's not one thing. It's kind of the big picture that you get from the patient, their caregivers, and all the resources from your therapists. I think one thing that's really important, Hugo, it sounds like you're doing, part of the history yourself, but that's really something important for the doctor to go through all of those steps. What was the mechanism of injury? What kind of things are you experiencing now? And then a good physical exam by a board certified physiatrist is important because they can pick up on little things that may not be focused on by another specialist.
And Dr. Swint, this is a great point, because when it comes to these mild TBIs, part of the difficulty in them is it's not like having a quadriplegic case. It's not an amputation case. It's not somebody who walks into trial in a wheelchair, or you can walk into a mediation and they look injured themselves. Often enough, I'm going to trial, I'm going to mediation with a client who looks perfectly healthy. I mean, I could walk in with somebody who looks just like Kyle. And you look at him, he's walking, talking, he doesn't look injured. But
Right.
Spend an hour with Kyle and you will realize that he's injured. And a mild traumatic brain injury is a degenerative disease. He is going to get worse as time progresses, and he's going to then get rapidly worse as time progresses. And as lawyers, we sort of need to convey that to a jury and prove it to a jury. He may look normal today, but he's not. On the inside, his brain is sort of washing away like the wetlands. But he talks, he speaks, and the defense is quickly going to take advantage of that and say, look at Mr. Kinberger. He's talking to you, he's walking fine, he's laughing. They're going to tell you that he's injured, that this is a multi-million-dollar case. Look with your eyes. It doesn't make sense. And that's why when it comes to these cases, it really, you have to build a team. And Kyle brought up a great point at the introduction. It's like an iceberg. You go to trial, you go to mediation, you see the tip, you see the diagnosis, you see the life care plan, the vocal report. You don't see all the work underneath it. And that is where building your case and maximizing value for your case and maximizing the recovery for your client so that they can be taken care of for the rest of their life, to have the medical care they need for the rest of their life, to be able to live with dignity. That's where the work comes in. And the reality is there are some great lawyers out there, and they can walk in there with any patient, little to no experts, and they're going to get $100 million judgment just on their skill and ability. That's fantastic. If you're one of those great lawyers, I admire you. I'm not, and mostly what I focus on is trying to teach other lawyers who don't have those skills that everybody can do these cases, and that as long as you're willing to put in the work, read the records, talk to people, read medical literature, you can build a case, and you can build a case that is medically sound and that is provable. Because another aspect of my practice is appellate work. So often enough, I get a call from a lawyer that says, I just got a huge verdict. Okay, fantastic, congratulations. And if you just did, fantastic. But now taking me to a court of appeal. Because as you can imagine, on a traumatic brain injury case, those verdicts can range, in the multi-million-dollar numbers. Okay, so what's your evidence on appeal? Well, no, I had a great venue. I'm a great trial lawyer. I convinced the jury. And now we have to be able to hold it on appeal. If you're in federal court, we have the maximum recovery rule. You're subject to that as well. Most state courts that I practice in, they will look at a verdict and say, does it shock the consciousness? That is only when you look at physical pain and suffering for us lawyers. I will tell you this, when you have a life care plan and a VOC report that documents economic losses, past and future, appellate courts tend to leave those untouched. And when they look at these judgments, they say, what are the damages? If those are damages, the physical pain and suffering damages tend to be much more respected. So I think that the best service we can do for a client is to build a comprehensive plan with economic damages that helps basically prove your injury. So one of the things you're going to need is a team. And yes, somebody like Dr. Swint, who is your neurologist or your physiatrist, is going to be necessary. But Dr. Swint, what other specialties do you rely upon to come up with your diagnosis of TBI? Because every time I've asked you for help, you've never been able to get me a diagnosis in the first visit.
Right, I can't. I actually had a Zoom meeting with a lawyer recently, and he asked me to speak with a patient over Zoom and then give a diagnosis of brain injury based on what they said. And I said, I absolutely can't do it. I talked to the guy for 30 minutes. He seemed like he had some deficits, but that's just one piece of the puzzle. So the clinical picture, the history taking, all of that's important. Conversely, I had another patient or another lawyer who had a DTI. So one of these imaging that shows that there was an injury in a certain part of the brain. And they said, well, look, this patient has a DTI that shows brain injury, if they have a brain injury. And again, some of these imaging tools are great pieces, but it's all a big puzzle. And so you can't rely on just one thing to make a diagnosis of a brain injury. In patients that I have, when I take the history, if I notice any type of visual deficits, which a lot of them have, I will send them to a neuro-ophthalmologist. Not just an ophthalmologist, not an optometrist. Those doctors are great in their own field, but a neuro-ophthalmologist that really deals with the brain functioning, and especially those who have had an injured brain and the way the eyes work. I send them to an audiologist or a neuro-otolaryngologist because they specialize in how the brain functions and their hearing. A lot of these patients have the ringing in the ears, and that can, really distract them and keep them from being able to do a lot of their activities because of the annoyance or hearing loss. So getting them in with an audiologist. Sleep specialists, which a lot of times are pulmonologists. A lot of sleep disturbance after a mild brain injury. PTSD or depression, anxiety, all of these things that go along with mild brain injury. So them seeing a psychiatrist and a psychologist. So it's a wide team that helps me in not only establishing the diagnosis, but also improving the patient's prognosis. But as you said, Hugo, it's not something that I'm going to have them visit all these specialists. They're going to get treatment and they're going to be better per se. They're going to show improvements, but a traumatic brain injury is a chronic condition that's a lifelong condition. And we can make improvements with therapies and with specialists, but it's not something that's going to go away.
So Mike, two quick questions. Sorry. Dr. Swint, could you please repeat the website that you mentioned earlier?
Sure. It's the American
locating a physiatrist.
Sure. It's the American Academy of Physical Medicine and Rehab. So it's aapmr.org. And I think on there it's something, one of the tabs says about physiatry. And then if you scroll down, it says find a physiatrist or find a physician. And there, you can actually put in your zip code and however many mile radius you want. You can put in there like find a specialist, like if you want to type in brain injury specialist, but sometimes we're not always listed per specialty. So I would just go first with your zip code and your range of miles.
Okay, thank you. And then Hugo, the intake questionnaire that you mentioned, is that something you can send to Ginger? There's been a request by an attendee to get a copy of that. Are you willing to share that with Ginger so she can provide a copy to attendees?
I will be glad to share it. It's not a problem for me.
Okay.
Although Dr. Swint didn't mention it, so I'm guessing my cute little questionnaire is a waste of time.
Your questionnaire is great.
So Dr. Swint, you brought up the word DTI. And up until a few years ago, if somebody would have told me DTI, I would have looked at it and be like, what was that? But we're talking about the MRI, a 3 Tesla MRI with DTI, and the DTI being a special technology which looks at water molecules in the brain, correct?
Correct.
And often enough, I get lawyers come to me and say, hey, man, I got a great case. It's a TBI. I'm like, okay, what you got? Like, I got a DTI that shows, something. I'm like, okay, and what's a TBI coming in? Well, it's a DTI with 3T MRI with DTI. That's going to be a brain injury. I win. And I often have to have a hard conversation telling them, well, here's the thing. First of all, your DTI is going to be challenged in court like you have no idea. I mean, there is a growing body of literature on the defense side that will challenge DTI. Every time I have DTI in a case, I know I am going to get a Daubert motion. And I know I am going to see a paper by Emory in which they said DTI is not ready for the courtroom. And there's a body of literature on the other side that says, well, DTI, this technology is accepted. It's been around for 10 years. It's been accepted in all courts. But you do get some judges who get a little cautious about it. And the worst part of all is DTI, every expert will tell you, even your own neuroradiologist. So when you're building your team, you will need a physiatrist, who is the person who's going to make a clinical diagnosis. A TBI is not a diagnosis that can be made on a test or based on a film. It is a clinician who will sit down and examine your patient, look at other possible conditions and say, no, it's almost attributed to a traumatic brain injury. You will need a neuroradiologist who's an expert in reading brain film. And even the best neuroradiologist will tell you a DTI scan is more sensitive than specific just because you have positive findings. And if you've ever seen a DTI scan, it looks really cool for trial. I mean, it's kind of like a mohawk, fantastic, but I can't tell the difference between a regular one and one that's, abnormal. That's why you need a neuroradiologist. And it can confuse a jury as well. So you're going to need that. And you're also going to need a neuropsychologist. So often enough, when I'm building these cases, I like to build them like a puzzle. Because as Dr. Swint mentioned, a lot of the symptoms can be attributed to different issues. So I say, okay, so we have an injury. I've already applied my cute little questionnaire that I'm glad to share with you guys. And we have some signs here. We have a neurologist saying, I think you have a traumatic brain injury. That's my diagnosis. We have on top of that layer, a film that says, listen, you have an injury to a part of the brain closely related to where you had your impact. And then we have neuropsych testing. And Dr. Swint, can you give us like a brief overview of what does neuropsych testing cover?
Sure. So neuropsychology I find very beneficial to these patients. They do a multitude of tests. It's usually an all-day test, which is it's hard for anyone to concentrate, but especially patients who have had an injury. And they go over everything from visual scanning to memory questions, short-term memory, visual memory, auditory learning, hand grip strength. They do a lot of different tests to see how the patient performs on them. And then they also do some of the depression, anxiety to try and kind of weed out, are these things more based from a psychiatric standpoint? Are they more based on a brain injury standpoint? And they're able to kind of decipher where the patient has their strengths, where they have their weaknesses, and then determine, and again, another piece of the puzzle, how the patient's doing and functioning, and where we need to focus some of our therapies. So,
as we're building this puzzle, this is where it really pays off to work with great providers like Dr. Swint, and to talk to them and to understand what's going on with your client, because she mentioned the neuropsych testing. The defense is going to get their IME, and they're going to say, the deficits are there, yes, but A, it's malingering, he's faking it, or B, it's emotional. I've seen expert reports on the defense side that said, listen, if you just tell Mr. Kinberger that he doesn't have a traumatic brain injury, he will be as good as new. I mean, that is the medical equivalent of rub some dirt on it and he'll be fine. So they're gonna use that against you, but we're putting these puzzles together. Another thing that came up, I just saw a question about DTI, yes or no. DTI is fantastic. It doesn't always help you with proving an injury. Sometimes your DTI can be negative and you can still have a traumatic brain injury. One of the things we look for is, did you have volumetric loss of the brain? So a lot of defense lawyers get really happy when you have DTI because they think they're going to attack you and challenge you. And they don't realize that, like I said earlier, a brain injury, I always explain it like, because I'm in Louisiana, it's like the wetlands. You're kind of losing, land every single minute that happens. And your brain injury is sort of washing away too. When you have volumetric loss, that is a great way to explain it to a jury. But again, you're going to need experts to come in and tell you whether you have volumetric loss and how they measured it. And that is almost separate and apart from DTI. Now, Dr. Swint, do you ever rely on other tests like spectroscopy?
Again, all of these are pieces to the puzzle. It's not something that I order regularly, but if a patient's had it and they come to me, I consider it. I again, look at the big picture. I think another thing we haven't really talked about is a lot of these patients were in a traumatic accident and they have other injuries like neck injuries, back injuries, things like that. And taking those into account in the big picture. A neck injury may cause headaches, may cause long-term issues with needing therapies and stuff like that. So I think, looking at the case as a whole, again, is important.
So one of the important parts, at least to me, when I go and try these cases or, present these cases, is I know I have this invisible injury. One of the most important things, and I have clients come to me and lawyers come to me all the time and say, listen, I got a TBI. Okay, fantastic. What next? How do we maximize a case? How do we prove the damage model? Most of my cases are in very conservative jurisdictions. I mean, I'm in the deep South. You don't get more conservative. And I got the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals right above me. So I am fighting an uphill battle almost every time. When I get a case that's not in the deep South, I'm quite elated. But that's not normally my luck. The issue is going to be this. You're going to go in front of what may be a great jury, but you also run the risk of a very conservative jury in Mississippi, in Alabama, in Texas. How do you convince a conservative jury that your client, who looks just like Mr. Kinberger, perfectly fine, has a traumatic brain injury and is injured? One of the ways that I have done it in the past to show the extent of the injury is medical care. It's quite simple. The first question that conservative juries ask you in a focus group is this: well, how much medical care has he gotten? So if Kyle has been through a traumatic brain injury program and he's getting that care, guess what's going to happen? The jury is likelier to believe he's got a traumatic brain injury. And I can tell you this, in most jurisdictions, there is a jury charge that gets read to the jury that says, if you present a bill, unless it was incurred in bad faith, that bill is owed. And as we talked about these IMEs, the defense is always going to get a neurologist IME or a neuropsych IME or a neuroradiologist or a physiatrist IME. And they're going to say, no, Kyle's fine. Nothing wrong with him. But you get to cross-examine him. And you get to ask him, Dr. X, isn't it a breach of the standard of care to prescribe medical treatment to a patient that is unnecessary. Having done medical malpractice myself, I can tell you, most physicians want nowhere near that. And they're going to say, yes, that is a standard of care. Are you saying that Dr. Swint breached the standard of care by prescribing this treatment? And you will see how quickly they turn and run for the hills. No. I just wouldn't have done it that way. But I'm not saying that's unnecessary. I'm not saying she breached. That is a huge, arrow in your quiver there for your traumatic brain injury. Now, part of the benefits of this medical care is you get to work with providers like Dr. Swint, who can observe your patient. Now, another issue that comes up, facility care. Dr. Swint, is facility care limited to the most severe brain injuries, or who can benefit from it?
Right. So, like I said, I'm at a post-acute care facility, and we had our patient in common who is walking and talking, and you might pass him on the street and have no idea. So he is a great candidate for our program. And I think, as you were just saying, when you were building this case prior and reading all the records, he had seen somebody for his neck and back, and he had seen somebody for headaches, a neurologist for headaches. And nobody had really put the piece of the puzzle together. And I feel like that's what a physiatrist can do, is they kind of are the gatekeeper for all of these areas to kind of put it together. When he came to our facility, though, as I mentioned earlier, that's when we could document everything on how he's living a day-to-day basis. He can't come into a neurologist outpatient office and in a 7-minute visit tell you everything that goes on his life from a day-to-day basis, from when he wakes up, all of his struggles through his day. He came to our facility for a month, and we're able to live that with him. We have 24-hour nurses that are there seeing him. We have behavioral specialists that's there seeing him. We have our therapists that are there seeing him. I'm overseeing him and seeing him regularly. The specialists are seeing him. So we're able to document every single bit of that, which in turn, I think improves your case that we have all that documented. So we were also able to really benefit him, and he was able to really improve. We saw him, a year and a half ago now, and I know he struggled a bit, and we would welcome him back to help work with him to try and improve some of these things again through therapies. And sometimes we need medication management. I try to minimize that, but if it's necessary, we certainly do. And so I think the documentation we can do by seeing the patient's day-to-day functioning is really imperative to these cases and the patient's overall outcome.
And that goes to the benefit of a place like Resilient, because you guys can take care of the patient for a short period of time and also for lifelong care, correct?
Sure. So we've had patients stay as little as a month. We've had patients who have stayed for a year. The plan eventually, at this point, we would welcome long-term care patients also, and eventually would like to build another. We have a 35-acre farm with a 7-bed acute or a post-acute house, and eventually build an entire new facility on the grounds for long-term care patients.
Now, Dr. Swint, some of the therapies that they get at Resilient include speech therapy. Now, the other day I brought that up in front of a defense lawyer and said, listen, my client needs speech therapy. And he pretty much laughed at me. He said, speech therapy? Did you forget it's a traumatic brain injury, not a lisp?
Right. So speech therapy is one of our most important therapies. And my patients look at me kind of crazy when I say that too, because they can talk. But speech therapy goes over memory tasks, functioning, reading. They do a memory book and a log. I have one patient who has diabetes who's having a really hard time managing that. And so she's going over how to, keep a log and how to do the day-to-day tasks. She'll go over, basic things with the occupational therapist too. They'll feed off of each other, like following a recipe for simple cooking and stuff. Now, a lot of these patients can throw a meal in the microwave, but they may put it in the microwave and forget to get it out. So what are the keys to making sure that they're doing that appropriately? So speech therapists are great. They also deal with swallow issues. And a lot of times in the mild traumatic brain injury, we don't have that issue. But swallow issues can certainly be an issue with brain injury.
Yes. And from the lawyer perspective, when we're doing these life care plans and this vocational rehabilitation, because in court, we have to be able to prove damages. So what is the future medical care that my client will need? What can he do? Can he go back to his profession? or can he not go back to his profession? The real advantage of working with, a facility and somebody who's observed them 24/7 for 30, 60, 90 days is every single aspect that they're going to be asked about. Well, can he do X? Can he do Y? Can he do Z? We've had a medical professional who's got experience with traumatic brain injury, observing and documenting and saying, yes, he can do it one day, but the other 3 days, he screws it up. Now, that is something that when we talk about building your team, you're also going to need a life care planner and a vocational rehabilitation expert who's going to sit down and talk to somebody like Dr. Swint or some other neurologist or physiatrist and say, okay, what are his limitations? Well, Dr. Swint, having observed a patient, and especially in our case, we worked together, she was able to sit down with them and say, listen, he can do X, Y, Z once a week, okay. The other times, he's going to mess it up. And through that, we were able to come up with a plan for our client that basically covers all the future medical care needs that he will need, and also focus on what he can do for employment. Now, the defense is going to have one IME. You're going to see him for maybe an hour. The Voc Rehabs maybe do a 30-minute interview, and that's about it. And based on that, they're going to come in and say, your client can do X, Y, Z. He's perfectly fine. That's fantastic. That's your argument for trial. I like to go to trial and say, Dr. Swint, for example, in the case that we worked together, for how long did you see this patient? 90 days?
Similar, so somewhere around there.
So I can go to trial and say, Dr. Swint, you've observed him for 90 days, and not just you, but your entire team observed him. Tell me what he can do. And I can go down the defense list of jobs that they say he can do and say, can he do this? Can he do this? Can he do this? And she can basically say, well, listen, I've documented on this date, he did it okay, but on this date, he did it wrong. On this date, he did it wrong. And on this date, he did it wrong. It is incredibly powerful to present that information to a jury or at a mediation to an adjuster. If you build your case properly, you can get a great result even in a mediation without having to go to trial for your client. But the only way you maximize your case is by presenting it like you're going to try that case and you're going to get that money. Like I always tell, defense lawyers and adjusters, listen, you can pay me now or you can pay me at trial. It doesn't matter. The only difference is I get emotional tax costs or I don't get that. But my value doesn't change. My quantum doesn't change. Now, in Charlie's case, I can't really show it to you because it's sort of confidential, but you can pretty much see the thickness of this right here. I can right there. It's a document. It is about 80 or 90 pages long, documenting every single item of medical care that this client will need. And we were able to do that with the help of Dr. Swint. Dr. Swint, if we can talk about one more item, and that is financial management. Can you tell us how that is affected in a traumatic brain injury?
Well, sure. As we joked, some people without a brain injury have trouble with financial management, but especially people with a brain injury. And so with these potential just everyday money and then potential settlement, how are these patients going to manage it? Because obviously they're going to have long-term medical needs and this money needs to go towards their long-term medical needs. And so our speech therapists and our occupational therapists go over money management tasks to see if they're able to manage those things. Usually the higher financial things, they can appropriately do that. And so we've talked about having, a trustee that is set up that would be beneficial to oversee where that money should go so that they have it for the longevity.
So let me bring that a little bit full circle here for the trial purposes. Once you've observed the client's inability to manage money or the patient's inability, you can get a recommendation for a special needs trustee. The benefit of that is really tenfold. First of all, the cost of managing the money for the patient and your client as a result of the incident gets put in a life care plan as an item of damages. Number two, I do a good bit of legal malpractice. So yes, I end up suing lawyers often, and I learned a lot from that. I protect my client no matter what. And it is a fantastic idea to at least have your client with a traumatic brain injury be assessed, whether they need a special needs trustee or not. Often enough, I get calls from people that say, listen, you settled my dad's case, you tried my dad's case, and we can't get to the money. That's correct. It's for your dad. It's not for you. As often enough happens, people with traumatic brain injuries end up, having a lot of friends right after they win their case, or they get a big settlement. They are likely to lose that money. If you want to get a quick bar complaint, just go ahead and give them a check without even looking at it. And then some bar associations might have some questions about that because, wait a minute, Mr. Chanez, you just claim your client can't handle finances and he's not in these cognitive deficits, are terrible, and yet you gave him a check for X million of dollars? What did you do to investigate and protect your client's interests? I cover myself. I go ahead and get the evaluation. I put in a life care plan. And third of all, when you're talking to a jury, and to a conservative jury, which is most of what I deal with, is the first doubt in their mind is, if we give Kyle $5 million, he's going to go buy himself a Lamborghini, a Ferrari, and have a hell of a time in Houston. I'm not giving him that money. He's going to spend it. He's going to blow it. His wife's going to take it. The beauty about building a special needs trust and getting the support from a physician that he needs it is, you get to have a trustee testify at trial. This money goes into a pocket designated for medical care and for future wages. This is not money that Kyle can take, in the middle of the night when he's got cognitive deficits and bad judgment, and go buy himself a brand new Ferrari or a Monet because he wants to, or spend it at the Gold Club. So a jury, whenever I put on a special needs trustee saying, hi, I'm special needs trustee. I have been hired in this case. I have built a trust. The money goes into this pocket. I manage the money. I'm bonded, licensed, and insured. I will take care of the management. I will follow the life care plan that Dr. Swint recommended and every other physician recommended. Let me tell you, it makes it so much easier for a jury to say, you know what? He needs that money. He gets that money. And once you start with that, your physical pain and suffering, your non-special damages tend to follow in line. And when you go to the Court of Appeal, you're in line to hold that verdict. And it's a lot easier to go to mediation and say, listen, here's what I'm putting in front of a jury. Here's what the costs are. Go ahead and try to stop me. I think that's you.
Hugo, I was going to ask you a quick question. One of the things that continues to come up, with cases week after week is attorneys who have these kind of, have these clients who have suffered an injury, and, they're trying to take the steps to maybe get to a diagnosis or get to somebody like a Dr. Swint, but, showing up to an appointment becomes an issue, or, they can't remember, or it seems like something always gets in the way. And I know a lot of lawyers always are asking, how do I avoid, or how do I combat some of these gaps that come in when trying to get these people where they need to go?
It's kind of what I said at the beginning. This kind of cases are going to give you heartburn. I mean, you're dealing with somebody with traumatic brain injury, which more often than not ends up affecting the part of the brain that controls your judgment. You're going to do things that, as a lawyer, I'm going to hang up the phone and literally close my eyes and say, you did what? What do you mean you put sugar in somebody's gas tank? What do you mean that you just want to get a job now as a deboner? You can't do these things. They give you heartburn. In fact, whenever you have a very difficult client, I say, go back to my cute little questionnaire. You might have a traumatic brain injury. Now, for those gaps in treatment, I think that's the benefit of working with somebody like Dr. Swint at Resilient or any other facility, because the best way to make sure they get the care is if they are at a facility. And when we talk about facilities, it's not a hospital. They're not tied down to a bed. It really is more like a high-functioning assisted living, and it really does help to eliminate those gaps. But on that notion, I mean, Dr. Swint, what happens when I have a gap in treatment? I mean, when is it too late, or when have I blown it?
Right. So you've never blown it. I mean, we've had patients that come years later that, somebody 12 months later, he was in this accident and we've just been trying to make things work for the last year and things aren't working. Could there be this brain injury? And by all means, there could be. So if you missed out on some time and are getting a brain injury months later, years later, you can still, through all these things that we've talked about, tie it back to that accident and get the patient the right treatment. You talked about how patients or clients, it's difficult to sometimes get them to appointments. And sometimes when they're at Resilient, it's hard to make them want to get up and go to their appointment too, but they're there and we're going to hold them to it. And so that's the benefit of them being there, is they are going to get the therapies that they need and they're going to get it every day. And there isn't going to be missing therapies. So they really do get a benefit out of it.
So just about a few weeks, go ahead, Todd.
Hugo, two quick questions. When you were just talking about having a special needs trust, established during the course of the litigation as opposed to later after a settlement, could you talk a little bit about that? One of the questions from an attendee is, how do you get your client on board to agree to that and basically, in their mind, relinquish control potentially over the money by having a special needs trust set up and having a trustee? And two, could you talk a little bit about how you utilize a special needs trust during the course of the litigation? Do you actually have the trustee named as a plaintiff in the case, or are they just a witness that you may call at trial?
Sure, and I'll start with the latter. It's a witness I call at trial. I don't have the trustee named as a plaintiff in the case. And that's about 90% of the time. There has been once where I've done it, but that was a very severe brain injury where the client wouldn't even be able to come to trial because he was bedridden at a hospital in Texas. Normally, I just have him as a witness. How do you get your client to agree to relinquish control of his money? It's not easy. It's hard. And it's a process. You don't have them come in the office on day 90 before trial and say, by the way, you're giving your money to a special needs trustee. As you go through this case, these cases are not quick. You have to work with your client and you sit them down and say, listen, what's going to happen when you get X number of dollars? Well, I'm going to buy a house. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. Okay. What's going to happen when you blow the money? What's your plan? And often enough, you will get a provider to sit with them and explain this out to them as well. It's not a one-time conversation. I can tell you, it's a conversation that probably has to start early on and has to continue. Because ultimately, if your client says, no, I don't want that, you're not going to hold on your life care plan. But if you do it early enough rather than post-settlement, you can charge the cost of administering that to a life care plan and make the defendant pay for that rather than your client. I sit them down with a group of trustees and say, you pick whoever you want. I have no dog in this hunt, but I do make sure they're bonded, licensed, and insured. You tell me who you like and who you get along with, because you're going to be in a long-term relationship. I think most clients, once you get to a good relationship with them, and I had a call with a client just 2 days ago and said, listen, actually the same client that Dr. Swint and I worked on, listen, we're getting close to the end. We need to talk about a special needs trustee. It's recommended. Now, he trusts Dr. Swint blindly, and if Dr. Swint recommends it, he's going to go with it. And I was very candid with him. I said, listen, what happens if your wife divorces you? What happens if somebody spends your money and blows it? After a 20-minute conversation, he said, you know what? You're right. I need to make sure that my medical needs are taken care of. I need to make sure that, my wages, which I would have earned, are taken care of. I want to be able to get better or not get worse. And if this is what's going to get me there, I'll do it. I'll tell you, so often enough, the hardest part is convincing the spouse.
Yeah.
Because they always want to say, I'll be the trustee, I'll handle it. And it's a hard conversation to have with them. And you have it over a period of time and let them know you are not the right person to be the trustee. We need somebody who, in case they make a mistake, we can sue them.
And I
That's
think some
the
of it,
conversation I have.
it's a hard conversation to have. I work in the subacute nursing home also, seeing the patients who transition from hospital to home. And we're always, people shouldn't drive anymore, or people can't go back to their home because they need 24-hour supervision. It's a hard conversation. People don't want to hear that. But going back again, kind of the theme is going back to the medical evidence that we're getting through all these people who are seeing them, that, you showed that you couldn't repeat 3 words after 3 minutes. How are you going to manage your money? And just having that conversation, I think early on, having it repetitively, hopefully that they understand at the end. But it's an important conversation.
I'll tell you something that I did one time, because I had a client who said, no, I'm perfectly fine. I mean, this is a guy who said he was perfectly fine all along, even though he had a traumatic brain injury with severe deficits. And he said, I manage my own money. I pay my bills. So I had him come in the office and say, okay, you pay your bills? Yeah. Show me your bank statements. He showed me the bank statements. And I knew for a fact, I talked to family members. He did try to pay his bills. He consistently missed payments, overdrew his account, and just didn't pay all the things, had him canceled, and said, what about this? What about this? What about this? Well, that was a mistake. Well, I made a mistake. Well, I made a mistake. Well, by 30 minutes of the conversation, I'm like, do you see why you can't handle this? Not to mention, there's also some benefits to the client in the ability to apply for Medicaid, Medicare in the future that helps you structure it. And it's a good way to tell the client, listen, this isn't just about taking the money away from you. It's about protecting the money. It's in case, listen, I tell clients, honestly, like I'll sit down with Kyle and say, Kyle, you have a brain injury. You have a big case. It's going to be several millions of dollars. But what's going to happen when your daughter gets drunk in your car and runs somebody over and cause a brain injury? You're getting sued. And what's going to happen with that money? So let us try and protect you. And that's probably the best way of doing it, having that candid conversation. And I've only once had a client say, nope, don't do it. And I had him sign a documentation saying, I've offered it to you. You don't want it done. That's okay. If something happens in the future and I get a call from a family member that says, listen, you said my dad had a traumatic brain injury and cognitive deficits, and you gave him a check for X million of dollars. I'm going to say, I offered it to your dad. I did what I could. He didn't want it. That's about as much I can do. You can't force it into a client.
You bring up
go ahead, Kyle.
Yeah, I'm sorry, bud. You bring up a good point with respect to, clients and having these candid, difficult conversations. I know, Dr. Swint, that, at Resilient, y'all have patients from all around the country, come to you, not just in Kentucky. And Hugo, you represent people across the country. I guess part of the other thing that I hear, you talk about avoiding gaps in treatment, but the flip side of that coin is, patients who really do need the care, and then you're talking to them about actually getting the medical care, knowing that you need that documentation, you need that, somebody following them from, a daily living standpoint. I've heard, well, my client doesn't want to go because they feel like they're going to be institutionalized, or, that they're going to a place that's going to strip away their freedoms. And, I hear more often than not people going, how do I get over that hump? How do I have that? How do I get somebody into the treatment that they desperately need?
Yeah. And that's also a hard conversation to have, because most TBI patients, especially the mild TBIs, think they're fine and don't want to go to a hospital. What do you mean you're sending me to Kentucky? I mean, I've never left the Deep South. I mean, Kentucky, where is that? Or what other facility they have? What do you mean I have to go to Texas? I don't want to go to Texas. I have a child. I have a mother. I have a wife. You got to talk to the spouse. And sometimes convincing the spouse to let them go is hard. What I do often enough is I say, listen, let's go on the website. Let's look at this place. I will give you options. And sometimes not all facilities are the perfect facility for every single client. I've been candid with clients and said, listen, go try it out for 15 days. If you don't like it, call me. We'll bring you home. And in this particular case that Dr. Swint and I worked together, our client tried a facility before Resilient, and he hated it. It wasn't for him. He called me up and said, I don't like it. And I kept my word with him and said, just come home. I'll withdraw. Come home. We'll find another place. I think that pictures, often enough, talking to other clients of mine who have been involved, I'll call in another client and say, hey, client X, you know, you went to this facility. Would you tell Kyle how you liked it? It helps a lot. It reduces the anxiety. And I think telling people, listen, try it for 15 days. Try it for a week. Go visit. It's like going to college. Go check out the campus. If you don't like it, come home. It's not a problem. We'll find another one. You're not stuck here. You're not going to get a client to say, okay, I'll just pack up my bags for 90 days and go live in Kentucky.
Right.
They don't agree with that quickly.
I hate that the word facility is even used. I mean, it's a beautiful large house on 35-acre farm. In non-COVID times, you know, people go to baseball games and out to eat, and you know, it's a social gathering of a group home. And we see these patients in real life environments. Say you go to a baseball game and there's, you know, a fan that's heckling 2 rows in front. You know, we have trained people who are there to help the patients get through that situation, to not have that short temper and go off on them. So, you know, we're working with the patient in these real life situations, and they may not realize that we're even working with them. They may just think they're going to, you know, the baseball game to have a hot dog and watch baseball. But it's all real life stuff that's helping them for when they transition out. We've also had quite a few patients who were from these places, had no interest in coming to Kentucky or being in Kentucky. And I think we have 3 right now that have actually gotten apartments here in Louisville, and we can keep a closer eye on them. They come out to the house and help with, you know, the yard work, or, you know, we've been able to give them some day-to-day activities to help on, so we can keep an eye on helping with their resources after they leave us.
That's awesome. Todd, you
Dr.
got
Swint, quick question. Are you aware of any similar type of facility to Resilient up in the Northeast and specifically in the New York area?
I don't know all the facilities around the country. I know there are, you know, other similar setups, but I don't know all the facilities. I'm sorry. I could look into that.
Okay. And then one other question. What is your advice, either Hugo or Dr. Swint, when you have a client that's exhibiting mild traumatic brain injury symptoms, but there may be minimal insurance coverage on the tortfeasor side, but that client needs diagnostic testing or neuropsych testing, you know, which is obviously very expensive, or they may need the type of therapy or rehabilitation that a place like Resilient can offer. What do you recommend in those situations?
Well, one of those things I look for, it really depends on your jurisdiction with the collateral source or not, but ultimately we got to take care of the client and get their needs met. I often ask, do you have insurance? Do you have Blue Cross, Blue Shield, Medicaid, Medicare, something that'll fund? And some of these facilities, I don't know about Resilience, if they're able to take private insurance or Medicare or Medicaid, it's a great way to get your client the care he needs, you know, regardless of what the lawsuit is about or regardless of the coverage amount. Dr. Swint, do you know anything about that with Resilience?
I know we take commercial insurance. I don't think we take Medicare or Medicaid, but we would have to ask the owners that specifically. But they have ways of working out things and trying to get the patients what they need.
And those situations where there may be lower limits in coverage, you know, obviously it would certainly depend on the case, but you know, like Hugo and Dr. Swint said, you know, typically there's going to be options, but you know, even reaching out to Kyle just to see what type of options there may be out there from a private, you know, coverage standpoint, or public benefits that may be available, or, you know, state or local programs, you know, those could always potentially be options as well. There was one other question from an attendee. What things should you absolutely do within the first 3 to 6 months when you have a client that you suspect has a mild traumatic brain injury and may not have had any diagnostic testing work up at that point?
That's actually a really good question. It's kind of a moving target. Maybe 3 to 4 years ago, I was told by a very well-regarded neurologist that the standard of care was wait 3 months if the symptoms persist, and you get your neurologist involved. Dr. Swint is shaking her head thinking, oh my God, you committed malpractice.
No, I would just approach it differently.
However, I will tell you this, as the standards change and the literature on this changes, I think most neurologists and physiatrists are in agreement. The earlier you get the treatment in, the better outcome you will have. So if you ask me, what must you do in the first 90 days to 6 months is observe your client, see if they have any of even the mildest symptoms. I mean, we mentioned a few, and I have my checklist I'm glad to share. You don't have to have all of them. You can just have one of those symptoms, but probably consult with a physiatrist. Get the whoever is the chiro or the PCP, the ortho, to say, listen, look at this stuff. You know, is this something where you get a different expert involved, a different expertise, a neurologist, a physiatrist involved? Get them involved early on. Even in cases where have small limits, you might do better that way because you'll be able to prove your injury a lot sooner or maximize, policy limits demands at that moment. Dr. Swint?
Yeah, I would agree. Getting them in with a specialist, such as a neurologist or a physiatrist, and getting them set up with therapies pretty soon. The earlier therapies have shown to have great outcomes. Again, you're not limited to only therapies in that acute period. You can certainly get benefit from therapies later on, but the earlier you get people plugged in, the better.
Having said that, just because you missed the 3 month to 6 month window doesn't mean you've committed malpractice, doesn't mean you've missed the boat on it. We've been able to take a case that was 2-3 years into litigation and go back and prove a brain injury from the date of the incident through medical records. I mean, it wasn't easy. It took a lot of work. We had to do a lot of digging and take a lot of depositions, but often enough, if you dig deep in those medical records, you will find that the TBI was there. So you might be 2 years into litigation. I mean, I got called on a case that was 2.5 to 3 years into litigation, and we were able to prove a traumatic brain injury at trial. So it's never too late to look at this issue.
One of the things that you touched on, and I know we're kind of coming down to the wire here, so I didn't want the time to escape without you addressing it, was the importance of kind of the life care planner as they really start to interact with somebody like a Dr. Swint who's observed somebody in actual treatment. And now we're talking about maximizing and projecting out what somebody's going to need for the rest of their life. A lot of times I get the question, after we've funded a case, hey, when do I get a life care planner involved? And I think it would be helpful for people to kind of understand, at what stage in the game does that really happen?
Yeah, well, there's kind of two approaches to this, and none is wrong, okay? There's some great life care planners who also are MDs who can give you a great life care plan. And you can hold that on appeal, that's fine too. I like to work with the treating physicians because they've observed the patient for a longer period of time. Juries tend to be a little bit more warm towards those treating physicians that have seen the patient. I normally take this approach. I mean, of course, your expert deadline is your expert deadline. You always want to do it, at least have a life care plan over to the other side at least 30 days in advance of a mediation if there is one. I try to make my mediation coincide with my expert report deadline because 30 days gives the defense enough time to digest it and figure out where we are. And then I go to mediation and say, listen, here's my life care plan. And it is now a checklist. It is a punch list. If we don't settle a mediation, I am going to go and I am going to start knocking off items off this list. And those are now becoming past medicals. Because one of the worst things that can happen to you is that you have this great life care plan and you get to trial and they ask the life care planner or Dr. Swint, you recommended so many therapies. Are you always done none? No, I wasn't aware of that. Oh yeah, I was aware of that. Okay, life care planner. Document your life care plan. He needs X number of treatments. He's done none in a year. What makes you think he's going to do any of this treatment? I see the life care plan as a checklist. I give it to my clients at the end of trial or mediation. I give it to the special needs trustee. I give it to the treating physicians. In the case of Dr. Swint and I work together, that life care plan, I sat down with the client's primary care physician he's in South Carolina, and said, I want you to look at this. And he said, uh-huh. I'm like, can you get the treatment here? He said, I don't even know what half of this stuff is. So no. I'm like, okay. Would you be okay if he gets it somewhere else? Yes, I would. And I recommend he gets it. And thank you. It's in my medical records now. And I will make sure he follows it. So short answer is at least 30 days for mediation, because that's the best way you can prove your damages. And otherwise you get the hammer of, I'm going to start checking it off. And often enough with defense lawyers, they think you're bluffing. And if you're not bluffing and you get 60 days out of mediation and they start seeing those, updated discovery responses come in with more bills and more treatment, they're like, damn it, he wasn't bluffing. He's going to prove this life care plan. And often enough, you get a call from the partner above them saying, listen, why don't we talk about this? And it's helpful, at least in my perspective.
Another quick question. What diagnostic tool or tools within the first 3 to 6 months do you think can make the most difference or be the most beneficial in proving a traumatic brain injury?
Well, I'm not a physician. I've only played one at a bar before, so I'm going to leave that to Dr. Swint.
So diagnostic tools, more like MRIs and DTIs and that type of, I assume you're speaking of. An MRI, if it's a diffuse axonal injuries, great. A DTI, if it shows it, is great. Again, all of these are pieces of the puzzle and not a home run hitter. Usually they have a CT scan in the hospital that usually is not very helpful. And I usually would not get a study again right away unless they showed some sort of immediate deterioration in the first few weeks. I usually would wait that 3 months or so before I got another scan. But an MRI with the weighting and the T1, T2 would probably be the next step.
Dr. Swint, often enough when I talk to people about the mTBIs, and I talk about DTI and MRIs, they say, oh, exciting, I'll get one tomorrow. And maybe you can clear it up for us. Why do you not want to get a 3T MRI with DTI the day after the incident?
Well, because it may not, there's swelling, it may not show the area that has suffered the most injury at that point. So you do need to wait some time. I would not recommend that right away. And you want to kind of show their clinical course. At first, give them a couple weeks to see how their symptoms are. The likelihood of them getting in with you that quickly or into a physiatrist or something that quickly is probably on the lower side anyway, but I would give it some time before you're having further imaging.
One time I explained it to a jury as in a brain injury is a microscopic injury and it takes time for the scarring to occur. It's kind of like cutting your finger. You'll have blood and then the scar will show up a few days later. I mean, was I completely ignorant about it or kind of makes sense?
No, you need to wait some time. I definitely would not get an MRI right away. And I would wait that 3 months mark, but follow the clinical picture in the meantime.
Kyle, did you have a question?
Yeah, no, I guess the last thing that, I was really kind of thinking about specifically with Charlie's case is really the, the family aspect and how the family interacts, whether it's spouses or kids. And, that's usually a very complex piece of the puzzle. So again, I know I've heard from a lot of people, what's the best way to manage them while still being able to handle somebody's, injuries in their case.
So again, the candid conversation, not that much in that case, but in others, I've had to bring in the spouse and say, I know you love him. I know you want to take care of him, but you need to realize one thing. A, you don't have the training to do it. I mean, often enough, you find that the spouse sort of wants to be the caregiver because they feel they're the only ones who can do it and will do it right. So I've had the conversation saying, listen, I know you love him. I mean, you married him after the injury because you got to take care of him. I get that. But A, you're not the most qualified person for it. If you want what's best for him, let's get him actual professional care. Second of all, he's going to deal with a lifelong injury. He needs you to be there as a partner, not as a nurse. And third of all is what's going to happen if you get hit by a bus tomorrow? Do you want to leave him to fend for himself or have a team to take care of him? That's a conversation I have. I don't know how Dr. Swint does it.
I have a similar conversation because we have this scenario with most of our patients is we're recommending somebody be there. And it's a hard conversation for both of them. We can provide some caregiver training, but again, they're not going to be someone who's gone to school and studied this for their life. I'd say just what Hugo says. You know, you are their wife or their husband. It's really hard to play two roles, to be the primary caregiver and the wife. You need to be the wife and have somebody else be the caregiver, and then you can chime in. I also say, you know, it takes a village, it takes other people. I myself can't take care of my kids 24 hours a day. You know, I have sitters help, I have my parent, you know, I have different people who help me. You can't be in charge of another person 24 hours a day. You need to take your respite breaks, you need to get out of the house, you need to make a living, you need to take care of your kids, you have your own responsibilities. So that's something to work into the life care plan, is somebody who can come in and help these people be as successful and independent as they can. But it doesn't need to be the spouse.
Awesome. Mike, I know that was a lot of information for everybody to digest. We were coming at it from all angles. Todd, I don't know if there are any other questions. I know we've been answering a lot as we've been, you know, progressing through the conversation. So,
Yeah, no additional questions at this point. It looks like, well, I take that back there. Dr. Swint, I'll ask you this. Are you able to comment at all on how you deal with the medical inflation rate for any of the modalities that you may lay out in your life care plans, or do you just leave that to the economist to deal with?
I generally leave that to the life care planner.
Okay, or to the life care planner, okay.
I mean, I normally use the economist for that. I think when you're doing these cases, you definitely need an economist who's familiar with the literature on medical growth rate projections. There's a couple of studies out there. Some have been challenged, some have not. But it's really something you have to consider, as we know that the cost of healthcare is growing faster than inflation is. And again, as lawyers, our job is to account for that. And there's a lot of literature on that too. So we'll get a good economist. And often enough, sometimes you got to talk to them and say, play devil's advocate with your experts. Because maybe the expert you used in one case isn't the right expert for another case. So it's a matter of finding the right fit. There was a question earlier about facilities in the north. I am far less concerned with the location of the facility and more with finding the right fit for the client. I mean, I've had clients go to Georgia, Texas, Kentucky, California, whatever is the best fit for them is what we normally do. I don't limit it geographically by my area.
And there's medical transport from the patient's house to the facility to make sure they get there safely.
okay.
And one other thing is, often enough that people have concerns, especially in those small cases, about, you know, how do I prove my case? If you've worked enough with your providers, if you've worked enough, you've read enough literature on this stuff, you can get by and you can do a great job for your client, even if the limits are low. You don't have to have, you know, $10, $15 million of coverage to prove a traumatic brain injury. You don't have to spend, you know, a ton of money. It really depends on how close you are with your client and your providers. Sometimes those cases that have mild traumatic brain injuries with lower insurance coverage values are probably the harder ones because you have to be very cautious. And the defense gets a little bit of an advantage on those, but you can still work them. Do a great job on them.
Well, thank you both for coming on and giving such great information, you know, and being able to be nimble enough to field the questions as they were coming. I think it was a lot of great information, you know, continuing to come out. Ginger, we were going to turn it back over to you.
I want to thank you so much for sticking with us. Continue to stay safe. I know there's a lot going on out there in the world right now. We can't wait to be back with you live one day and do real seminars in person. They're going to be a lot of fun. And until then, we're going to continue doing these webinars. I really want to thank Todd, Dr. Swint, Kyle, and Hugo. Thank you so much for being with us today and presenting. I'm going to make sure that everybody gets your contact information after this webinar ends. But I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Take care.
All right. Thank you all. Take care. Be safe.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.